Hello, everybody, and welcome to Litfic with a Mighty Blaze. The blaze was sparked in 2020 when COVID-19 extinguished the traditional in-person book tour. Our New York Times bestselling authors and co-founders, Jenna Blum and Caroline Levin, joined forces to promote new books coming out. This is Litfic. I'm Bo Ellis, a Facebook and social media director at The Blaze, a writer myself, and a producer. Today we're welcoming Katya Apekina, who wrote the new upcoming novel that comes out next Tuesday, so make sure you pre-order it. Mother Doll has that really beautiful, cool cover. Katya is a novelist, screenwriter, and translator. Her debut novel, The Deeper the Water, The Uglier the Fish, was named a Best Book of 2018 by Kirkus, BuzzFeed, LitHub, and others, and was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. She's published stories in literary magazines and translated poetry and prose for Night Wraps the Sky writings by and about Mayakovsky, and was shortlisted for the Best Translated Book Awards. She's written some amazing scripts that premiered at South by Southwest and has done a lot of amazing things. She was born in Moscow, grew up in Boston, and currently lives in LA with her husband, daughter, and dog, which sounds like an amazing little unit. So welcome, Katya. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. How has this tour been, or this promotion cycle been for Mother Doll compared to your debut novel?
Well, my book comes out March 12th, so it hasn't even come out yet, and I've been doing a lot of stuff. So it's been pretty exciting. Like I was at Winter Institute, which is like a conference for booksellers. I was at AWP, which is a conference for writers and writing programs. And then I've just been doing, some interviews like this as well. Yeah, it's been
Yeah,
fun.
that's great. And I really loved your novel a whole lot. I read it. And I was just really taken by every part of it. It's such a unique and interesting way of exploring motherhood, pregnancy, death, relationships, kind of everything. It feels like the whole human experience is kind of wrapped up in it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. What sort of gave you the inspiration for the premise of this novel, which is just very unique on its own?
So in the novel, this woman, Zhenya, she is in a marriage. They've decided not to have kids. She finds out she's pregnant. She's also really young. She's like in her early 20s.
Mm,
And she decides to keep the baby, to keep her pregnancy. And also during that time, which kind of implodes her marriage. And then at the same time, she gets a call out of nowhere from this medium who is channeling her great grandmother, who was a Russian revolutionary. And the idea of like talking to the dead to was something that kind of was inspired by my own grandmother having left me these memoirs. And
mm,
I started reading them after she died, even though she'd given them to me years before that. I, for whatever reason, like had this feeling of just resistance, and I could not bring myself to read them. And then the night of her funeral, I like finally opened up the document and I started reading them. And I also started translating them because they were in Russian.
mm,
And I was thinking, well, my daughter might want to be able to read these someday. So I started translating them. And then I also started just like kind of making these notes in the margins, like as if I was almost having a conversation with her.
mhm,
Um, and part of it like was excerpted and published in the LA Review of Books. But like that feeling of like talking to the dead was something I wanted to explore because in some ways, like the kind of conversation, which was obviously like one-sided, but sort of
mhm,
two-sided because I was like engaging with something she wrote, like was really interesting to me. But I didn't really want to write about like somebody finding a document or a journal and engaging with it because that didn't seem very like alive or exciting.
mhm,
So I wanted to do it like personify that and make the person she was talking to a ghost who could talk back, you know?
mhm.
And then other part of that too was, like, reading her story, I just kept thinking, like, "Why did I put off reading this?" You know? Because if I had read it earlier, of course, I would have been able to, like, actually talk to her about it. And I was always very curious about her life. I always, like, wanted to know about it, and yet I wasn't, like, able to bring myself to read
Yeah.
it. And so it's like, well, what was behind that, you know? And I kind of think now, like, looking back, that it was, this feeling of, like, oh, if I read about her, like, pretty traumatic life, you know, and all the difficulties that she went through, it would be, like, my burden to carry. I would n If I know about it, it means, like, it's mine, and I'm
Mhm.
somehow responsible for it, and I have to, like, carry this heavy weight, you know? But
Yeah.
then when I actually did read it, it was, like, totally the opposite, because I realized, like, "Oh, I've already been carrying this heavy weight that I didn't even know I was carrying, that I
Mhm.
didn't even know the source of it," you know? It was just kind of like there's a lot of things where, like, I would feel, like, hyper vigilant, you know, like, these
Mhm.
things where I felt um like, always as if, like, there was some sort of danger, like, also reading her stuff, like, the kind of details she notices in her writing were really interesting because they were very similar to my own writing in
Mhm.
some ways, like, where things just suddenly feel, like, off and alarming, you know, for
Yeah.
no reason, you know? And so, anyway, like, just seeing all these things and being able to kind of trace them to a source was really, like, surprising, eye-opening, and it also kind of made it so that I felt like, "Oh, this is a choice." Like, I can like, if you know where the source is coming from,
Mhm.
you see these sort of, like, impulses in yourself, you can also sort of, um, like, heal them, you know, I
Yeah.
guess is an easy way of putting it. So, anyway, so that
Mhm.
all of that kind of became transformed in a very
Mhm.
fictional way, in my novel.
Yeah, and I loved reading about that aspect as well, that sort of concept of the epigenetic trauma that Jaina doesn't even realize she's carrying with her as well. And as well, I related to the way that she struggled with like the way because she's very close with her grandmother in this novel. And the way she related to struggling with how her mother would describe her grandmother, because that's not the image that she saw, and she didn't kind of want to merge those two people in her mind because it felt like a betrayal in some ways to her grandmother and also just wasn't the person she knew. So it's a really fascinating concept of how different people are, different families. There's this concept I've talked about a lot with others that, even in one family, a group of siblings can have different parents, and not in the literal sense, which is also true, but in the sense that the same mother can be completely different with different children, and a grandmother can be completely different with different grandchildren or from herself as a mother. And I thought that was a really fascinating way to explore it in this.
Yeah. Yeah, with my first book, The Deeper the Water, The Uglier the Fish, it very much deals with, like, 2 sisters who grow up in a family and have just completely different experiences of their
Mhm.
parents. Um, but here, yeah, it's uh, the same thing where, like, the grandmother who is the daughter of the ghost who Zhenya is
Mhm.
talking about, she had been left in an orphanage, had a pretty traumatic early life, and hadn't really wanted to be a mother and was not a very warm or nurturing mother, and for many reasons to Marina, who is Zhenya's mother. And then Marina was also not a very warm or nurturing mother to Zhenya, but at the same time, for Zhenya growing up, she grew up with her mother and grandmother in the same house.
Mhm.
She's so close with her grandmother, and her grandmother's able to give her, like, that kind of nurturing that she wasn't able to give her daughter. You're absolutely right.
Mhm.
And yeah, Zhenya knows her one way and the mother knows her a different way. And also, in over the course of the book, her grandmother dies, and then Zhenya and her mother's relationship also, like, ends up reconfiguring as a result, because
Mhm.
think, like, you're right, Zhenya felt so close with her grandmother that seeing her any way other than the way the grandmother was presenting herself would have
Mhm.
felt like a betrayal, and seeing her the way her mother saw her sorry, seeing the grandmother the way Marina saw her
Mhm.
would have felt, yeah, like a huge betrayal. So all those relationships are very complicated and also evolving over the course of the book.
Mhm. Yeah. 'Cause the way Xenia feels about her own pregnancy and then her own child once she has her child, in contrast to how we read about and see the way other women and the way Irina, her great grandmother, even feels and asks her, like, don't you feel this way now that you have a kid? And she's like, honestly, not really. I feel differently from you. Was fascinating to see that sort of concept of like having a child is inherently going to change you as a person in ways you might not expect. And the way everybody reacts to it is a little bit different, which I also enjoyed reading about.
Yeah, I mean, I think for her, like, she is very stuck in her life at the beginning of the book. She doesn't feel like she has much agency. And then, like, the deciding to keep this pregnancy is
Mhm.
kind of like this first big decision that she makes, and it creates a lot of change in her life. And then, like,
Mhm.
listening to her great grandmother's story is also like a way for her to kind of like she's both looking forward with her new child and like back with her ancestors and like
Mhm.
kind of trying to integrate both. And she ends up, her life ends up really changing by the end of the book.
Mhm. And I loved sort of Jinya's emotional journey was one I think a lot of people can relate to. That she feels like and is somebody who's kind of constantly running in a sense from her own feelings, from taking accountability for things, from facing sort of things she just doesn't want to face, which is very understandable and I think relatable because I think even if you don't consider yourself a person who that's a severe problem for you, there's definitely been times for all of us where we've just avoided something we didn't want to deal with. um, and I love seeing kind of how that and the fact that she ran from what she even wanted, that she wouldn't admit what she wanted, and if she got close to it, she would run away from that too. And I wondered what sort of inspired that journey or that character trait for you to write about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very, like, directly related. Her kind of inability to be in touch with her own desires are
Mhm.
and being scared by them in some way and doing things that are kind of like the opposite of what she actually wants to kind of keep herself away from that
Mhm.
is not just like a quirk of her personality, but it is like a direct relation to this like ancestral burden or trauma
Mhm.
that she is that has sort of been passed down to her. And she's young, she's in her early 20s. And I think partly she doesn't feel like because she doesn't feel like she has agency or is like has any power in her own life,
Mhm.
she doesn't understand that she can hurt people around
Yeah.
herself. That like her behavior um can affect other people negatively,
Mhm.
It's like she thinks like little old me, like I'm nothing. Like who cares what I do sort of thing. But
Mhm.
like, that her own like assessment of herself is not other people's assessment of her.
Mhm.
And so, which I think is like so often the case, I think it's such a people really rationalize bad behavior. Usually people who behave
Mhm.
badly are not like evil, they're just like, they have reasons
Mhm.
for doing what they do and they
Yeah.
rationalize them. So I think like you see her perspective on it. And I have like empathy, which isn't the same thing
Mhm.
as thinking like, great, like these
Yeah.
are great decisions.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think the fact that she was like raised the way she was raised, she's sort of just like a little bit on autopilot at the beginning. She's sort
Mhm.
of just, she comes out to LA to become an actress with her best friend and her boyfriend, and it's not really like her dream, it's their
Mhm.
dream, and she's just sort of like glommed onto their dream,
Mhm.
So the kind of things that by the end she's sort of realizing are the things she actually wants are, I think like from the outside might look like, well, is this a good idea? Like her mother
Mhm.
questions whether it's a good idea. And there's reason to question it, because there's like a sense of um murkiness around like how everybody who's involved in the situation, without giving too much away, is
Mhm.
like, not necessarily on the same page. So
Yeah. No, and it was very interesting because while Jenya's in, I guess, not that unique situation of a pregnancy, a lot of people get pregnant under less than ideal circumstances. And I know from a lot of my friends who are, because I'm nearly 30, so I'm at the age where everybody's having children or getting married. And I'm content with my cats, but I respect the choice. That it does feel like if you are pregnant or if you're then a mother, literally everything you do is going to get criticized by everybody who views you. Even if maybe you're in the ideal situation or a good situation, and especially if you're in what other people consider a bad situation, they will take it upon themselves to let you know they think what they think about your pregnancy and your parenting.
so true. Yeah, I had a daughter who's now like almost she's 9.5, she's almost 10. So it was kind of a while ago, but I do feel, yeah, like before having children, I had opinions that after having a child, I was like, oh my God, what was that? Like, why did I think that I somehow could know what was like,
Yeah.
you just think when you're on the outside, you're like, well, why don't they do this? And it's like, they've
Mhm.
probably tried,
Yeah.
it's like, but yeah, I think definitely having a kid made me very humble about all that stuff because it's
Yeah.
hard.
Mhm. No, and that's something I've seen a lot where it's the sort of idea before you have children, or if you don't plan on having children, where you're like, oh, if I were a parent, I would do all of these really great, perfect things. And the other people who have kids who I see not doing that just can't handle it. And I would be different. And then when you get into the situation, you realize it's not quite as simple.
Yeah, it's hard, I think, raising
Mhm.
another person, finding the balance between like your own needs and wants and caring for someone else who,
Mhm.
you're like fully responsible for them, especially when they're very little, like they need you.
Mhm.
But I think it's also like whenever I hear people talking about it, I feel like the conversation is usually about how there isn't like enough support for parents, which there definitely isn't.
Mhm.
Um, but it's always sort of just like, oh, it's so hard. And people don't really talk about like how it's also lovely, I feel like that's like the secret sort of
Mhm.
thing that people feel but don't
Yeah.
talk about somehow. Like it's okay to talk about like how much it sucks to be a parent, but somehow it's not talked about like how joyful it is, I mean, I
Mhm.
don't know. I think it's just because like joy is hard to talk about and like in general,
Mhm.
But I think, or it's like it seems as if you're, I don't know, like bragging or
Mhm.
yeah, I don't really know why it is, but I do feel like it's kind of like the conversation is often like really skewed towards the kind of negative parts of it,
Mhm.
which definitely exist, and I'm not in no way like negating them, but for most people, they're like also in balance with other things too.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine there has to be a lot of joy. Just, I mean, I know my own mother who has feelings about choices she's made that she maybe regrets, but has that always stressed that she has never regretted her children for a second, and that's been one of her just continuing sources of joy is getting to. And now I'm her youngest child, so we're all grown up. We're all scattered around the world. But still getting to have us and when we all get to come back together, I know it's been a source of joy. And I do feel like I read an article about this actually, that there's been a shift with like social media trends from showing motherhood, like showing this very idealized version of motherhood of these people who have their perfect beige nurseries and kids who never seem to be crying, to showing it as kind of like a constant miserable thing where they're like, oh, I've been up 12 hours and nursing's not going well and this baby has been crying the whole time, and haven't been highlighting that it's either kind of an extreme. It's either people show it as perfect or miserable. And there's very little acknowledgement of that balance of in between where, of course, everything actually lives.
Yeah, and I feel like also there's this like assumption that because you're a parent, you're somehow like, I don't know, there's just like such, especially with mothers, like there's this assumption that I will have like the same interests as like my child, which is just so weird because it's like
Yeah.
I'm an adult. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fine if you're like into that stuff also, but it's just like, why would you assume that I am? You know, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it just feels very like infantilizing and weird. Um, but I don't know. It is, I think like with mothers, there's just this expectation that that becomes your full identity somehow,
Mm-hmm.
which you know, I reject, and I think like lots of people reject that. And
Mm-hmm.
but that's definitely, I think, like kind of an unspoken thing that's just sitting there. So like, you know, even if you reject it or don't reject it, it's kind of like an expectation, I think, to some
Mm-hmm.
extent, which I think if you're kind of like sensitive to that kind of stuff, you're just like aware of it as an expectation. So even if you personally reject it, it just like kind of seeps in to some extent. And so I think that's why there's like so much talk around like mom guilt and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you are like, this is really stupid and like I don't,
Mm-hmm.
you know, believe in these values or whatever, if like it's just in the air, it's hard not to like absorb it subconsciously to some extent.
Yeah. And I've noticed that from a lot of friends I have who are mothers, where they really want to push back against the idea that being a mother has to be their whole identity, but at the same time feel like very judged for that, where they feel like it's like, oh, you don't devote yourself 100% 24/7 to your child. That makes you a bad mother, which is not
Yeah.
a fair standard.
Yeah. I mean, I think also like usually when we feel judged, it's because we're judging ourselves, you know?
Hmm.
I think if I mean, I guess that's not like 100% of the time true, but I think
Yeah.
usually those are the kind of judgments that hurt because
Hmm.
if someone is like judging you for something you feel totally neutral about, then you don't have like usually any sort, it doesn't really hurt, you know?
Hmm.
But I think with this stuff, it's like, of course, you want to be like the best parent possible and you love your child very much, you know? But I don't know. I mean, there's like a lot of talk, I feel like, of the good enough parent. And like I subscribe very fully to that, you know?
Yeah. And I think I mean, it makes sense because you don't want to feel like, oh, because I took time for myself, it somehow hurt my kid, which I think ideally is not true, because I think having parents with a strong sense of identity helps children, is what I've seen a lot, again, from my own experiences of being a child at one point in my life, and from the parents who I'm friends with, is that seeing parents with a strong sense of identity helps those kids, I think, develop their own sense of identity. They like can imitate those things that you're doing as well, which helps them form their own sense of independence.
Yeah, I think so.
And everybody I know who has helicopter parents usually is miserable about it. So,
Yeah, I think that's hard too.
hmm, which this novel, I think, lends itself to just so many discussions on motherhood because of the so many different facets and perspectives of it that are shown, um, which I loved reading about it. Of course, motherhood is going to be somewhat of an important topic when the name is Mother Doll. um, and I was wondering, and this might be an obvious question, so forgive me if it is, but if the name is obviously a reference to also the Matryoshka dolls, which I might be saying slightly wrong, but with my Americanized way of pronouncing things, but that it's also about that, a metaphor for that epigenetic trauma, that kind of you're yourself, but within you are also your mother, your grandmother, your great grandmother, and so on and so forth back.
Yeah, and you're also like different parts of yourself too,
Mm-hmm.
like your inner child kind of idea. Um, I think there's like I was really interested in like parts work. It's like a type of
Mm-hmm.
therapy that involves, yeah, like talking to the different parts or aspects of yourself. And I think that's also a facet. Then there's also the fact that Zhenya is pregnant, so she's like
Mm-hmm.
physically there's like another person inside of her, and then at one point she's possessed by a ghost, so then there's like a ghost inside of her. And then also, yeah, exactly, like the epigenetic stuff of like your ancestors are inside of you and their experiences. But like to go back to the parts, like the Irina who
Mm-hmm.
is the ghost who Zhenya is talking to isn't like the full person Irina. She is just like a particular small aspect of Irina. She's like the shame from her um, early life that the Irina who then like became an adult, immigrated to the US, had like a completely new life. It was like her secret self that she like locked away, never confronted, never like integrated into herself. And so it's like just an aspect, like a shard of a person that is like stuck in this like purgatory type of space. Um, so yeah, I think a lot about that in terms of um like parts of yourself and like how they are kind of, you have this illusion often of yourself as this like constant full thing, but
Mm-hmm.
like you're actually constantly changing. You're made up of like, if you like think about your like gut biome and how it's
Mm-hmm.
like this bacteria is like creating your sense of reality, and like if it's
Yeah.
out of balance you have a different sense of reality. I mean, I don't really like go into that directly in the book, but I'm just saying that like you're not this kind of solid constant thing the way that you
Mm-hmm.
perceive yourself to be. You're like made up of lots of teeming aspects and parts that are like shifting constantly and evolving, or
Mm-hmm.
devolving or changing, or I guess in Irina's case they're not changing, they're being stuck, and that's
Mm-hmm.
why is in this sort of other space.
Yeah, and that I also really loved, the idea that a ghost could be just one fragment of a person, not like their whole self, like we usually think of ghosts, as much as we think of ghosts. It's usually like that whole person, their quote unquote soul, their essence, is just trapped. But this is like, no, it's just one piece of her who is trapped because that piece couldn't move on the way the rest of her moved on, because that piece was never, like you said, confronted, was never integrated, was just shoved completely away. And that, feels like it makes a lot of sense in both the ways we kind of haunt ourselves with our own past versions of ourselves who we are ashamed of, or maybe wish were different, had made different choices. We blame ourselves a lot for the choices our younger selves made, and it's sometimes justified, sometimes not. I do that a lot and have tried to work on the idea of like, hey, you made the choices you made with the information you had at the time. You didn't know what you 10 years from now would know.
Yeah.
um,
I feel like now the conversation around that stuff is often about like compassion and offering yourself
mhm,
compassion in that way of like acknowledging you did the best you could, or, so I do feel, and in the book too, it's like compassion that is able to shift things ultimately.
mhm. And that I always love. I love seeing also how Jinya's relationships with certain people changed over the course of the book. Both how she got confronted by the fact, like you said, she thinks like, oh, I can't hurt people because I'm just me and they're more successful or they're better than me in some way. So what I do obviously doesn't matter to them because I'm less than them in a way. And then gets confronted with the fact that like, no, you actually do hurt people, which seems like an obvious message, but I think we've all had those moments where we didn't realize, like, oh, what I did I thought didn't matter, but it actually really mattered to this person. And now I'm in this place where I haven't even apologized to them because I just assumed I didn't have to.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like part of growing up is having those
Mhm,
realizations, and I think in a lot of ways it's a coming of age story.
mhm.
I do feel like we come of age at many different ages, you know?
Yeah.
We're continuously coming of age. I feel like I'm like sometimes, like, oh, I'm an adult. Like it just seems so strange, even though I've been adult for like decades now.
Yeah.
Mm.
No, it is interesting, and the way Jinya gets kind of focused on this idea of like, oh, there's one moment that sets your life onto the path, and she gets kind of focused on that for a second, and it's like, when is my moment? Is this baby going to be my moment? Am I, an egg that's hatching, or am I a rock? Which was a metaphor that I really liked. But it is something that I think we do get fixated on, is that the idea that there's one moment that things begin from there and everything before that moment doesn't matter anymore, because maybe that's a little easier to imagine.
Yeah, I think there's like always this sense of like, oh, I'm gonna arrive, you know?
Hmm.
And it's like there's no arriving. You realize that at some point that like the horizon line continues to move with you,
Hmm.
and you think like that things are gonna somehow be different when X. And like they
Yeah.
are different, maybe, but in some ways they're still the same, and
Yeah.
like you think that like I think especially with like ambition and success, like people often think like who are really driven, like, oh, when I get there, you know,
Hmm.
and then like they get there and it doesn't feel at all different. So then they're like, no, no, that was just the wrong destination. When I get there, and you can just like keep doing that endlessly until like it starts to occur to you that like there is no there.
Hmm.
Um, but I think in the process, you probably are changing and your life is probably looking very differently, but it doesn't feel any different. And it's that feeling that people want. It
Hmm.
doesn't really matter what reality is or isn't. It's like how you feel about it or interpret it that
Hmm.
matters to you in your like daily life. Like
Yeah.
you
And
can have this success, but it doesn't um give you that sense of validation that you're just striving for endlessly. Like, the fact that you have it doesn't really, like, matter. You don't have that sense of satisfaction about it, that you
Mhm.
expected to have. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I do feel the setting, which is primarily LA, not all the time, but primarily LA, and I know that's where you live and have lived for a while. Kind of works very well with that, because I know a lot of people who are like, once I get to LA, then my life is going to start for. And I've mentioned I'm a theater person. I'm dear friends with many actors, writers, directors who have this attitude of like, once I get out of my small town and I get to LA, then everything is going to happen. It's going to all fall into place. And sometimes it does happen, and sometimes it happens a little less or doesn't happen at all the way you're thinking it's going to happen. So, did you
Yeah,
find, yeah.
I think with acting, it's, like, particularly my sense in LA, like, I'm not in
Mhm.
the film world, like, very directly, so my sense of it is sort of from like an outsider sense, but it definitely feels like like a place where people with a lot of big dreams come, and then sometimes it does seem like, oh, overnight, just poof, like they arrive, and
Mhm.
that like and it feels almost kind of like a slot machine type of feeling of like you never know, and like if you just happen to be at the right place, because so much of it is luck, as
Mhm.
well as talent, and you're aware of that, and like that sense of like, well, excitement, and like if you're in the right place at the right time, maybe something will happen, all of that sort of stuff, which I explored just as much, I think, in the revolution part of the book of Irina retelling her kind of going to parties with Rasputin and like,
Mhm.
that sense of just like excitement there. But like, yeah, that feeling of just like being young and like being like let out into the world almost for the first time and feeling like anything could happen.
Mhm. Yeah. And it was interesting to see the various ways that goes for Xenia, Jinya, and the two people she came with, whose dream she sort of just, you know, hooked herself onto when she wasn't really interested in acting before. Which it is something people say, if you don't really love acting, don't go for that. Unless you're really lucky. Because it's a lot of misery if you don't really care about it. Although
Yeah,
there's like a lot of things.
I think there's so much rejection that I mean, as a writer, there's so much rejection
Mm-hmm.
also, but with acting, it does feel like it's just so much more direct, and it's like you're being rejected, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Or it can feel that way more so than like your work is being rejected.
Mm-hmm.
Because like your work is in your body, you know? So it just feels very like, I think more personal, the rejections for an actor. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
an actor, but I would assume.
It is. I do think it's like that from my experiences doing some acting, where it is, because in a lot of ways it is personal when they don't want you because they don't want your look or someone with your voice or somebody who just has your vibe. So it is kind of a personal, not like we just felt your writing wasn't the right tone for our publication. It's more like just you weren't the right tone for us,
Yeah.
which is fine. And you have to learn not to take it as personally because you'll make yourself insane otherwise. But it is interesting. And I do think it can contribute to a kind of loss of self esteem for sure, which uh, I was wondering if that kind of also played into Zhenya's loss of self esteem, or if sort of that loss of self esteem was already there. So it was kind of just her getting into what she expected.
Yeah, I think it was probably a combination of both, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like she growing up like was pretty isolated. Like her grandmother was the person she was closest to, you know, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is like kind of unusual to be like a teenager and your grandmother is like your
Best
best
friend.
friend,
Yeah.
you know. But so yeah, I think she felt like kind of apart from the world in a lot of ways. And I'm sure that was connected to like being an immigrant also, you
Mm-hmm.
know, you feel very like other. Um, but then I'm sure acting and being like constantly rejected and knowing that you're not very good at it as you're doing it. Like I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's like kind of a setup for feeling worse, you know? But I
Yeah.
think people often do that, right? It's like if you think a certain way about yourself, you then put yourself in these situations to reinforce what you think already about yourself often. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
do that all the time.
Yeah. And that's the sort of cycles that Jinya finds herself in, that she sort of puts herself in, were also really a part I loved reading about. I feel like I'm saying that about all the parts, but I did really enjoy this book. I thought it gives you a lot to think about during and after, and it approaches life and the afterlife in such an interesting and unique way. And that is something I just remembered. I did want to talk about the perception of this kind of afterlife purgatory esque space that's kind of a crowded subway car, is how I saw one review describe it, which felt very accurate because it's a lot of different people mixed into one emotional space, almost like an emotional fog made up of a bunch of different people all trapped together. What sort of brought that configuration to mind? Because I haven't seen a lot of other works approach the afterlife in that manner.
I think it was kind of 2 things. I wrote this book during the pandemic. I was taking mediumship classes
Mm,
for as research for this book, and doing these, like, psychic meditation classes also, and so some of the descriptions of the afterlife kind of came from, like, the kind of visions or whatever I was having during those meditations, those, like, guided meditations.
mhm,
Um, and then I was just, like, on so many Zoom meetings where people it was just disembodied voices, people were constantly because of, like, shitty internet, and, you know, Zoom was, like, new during the pandemic, or it wasn't new, but it was, like, newly, I
mhm,
guess, used so widely, and it was just people talking over each other by accident, and then, like, the awkward pauses, and then the
mhm,
start stops, you know, all of those sort of disconnected voices, I think I didn't think about that when I wrote it, but, like, looking back, I was like, "Oh, that's probably what inspired some of that sense of
Mhm.
just, like, a cloud of disembodied voices, like, talking over each other." That sounds
Yeah.
like a lot of group Zoom meetings I've been on.
Yeah, and during the pandemic, I was somebody who never got to stop working, so I do not relate to everybody's, like, "What I did during lockdown when everything stopped," I was like, "Well, nothing stopped for me." I worked in higher education, and I managed a residence hall, and we were one of the few residence halls that didn't shut down, so I had to keep going with all my students and keep going to all these meetings, and I do remember just, like, borderline begging students. I was like, "Please just have your camera on." It is so strange and disconcerting to have these meetings where I'm trying to talk to you and I'm just looking at nothing.
Yeah.
um, which is interesting because that's how phone calls work, and yet with Zoom it feels worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, now that I'm used to Zoom, phone calls do feel kinda weird. I mean, phone
Mhm.
calls where it's, like, a group call, I think
Yeah.
especially feels kind of weird, like a conference call,
Mhm.
um, because there's just, like yeah, it's hard not to it's helpful to see people's faces to gauge their reactions to,
Mhm.
conversations.
Yeah. And it is I am interested in the fact that you took mediumship and sort of psychic meditation classes for that. How did you find that experience?
Um, it was pretty interesting. Um I feel like my sense of it sort of shifted, but, like, the psychic stuff was really fun, and I've
Mhm.
definitely felt like like, when you're writing, it often feels like you're sort of channeling something,
Mhm.
So it's kind of like a similar feeling to that in some ways, where you're just, like, kind of, like, relaxing and opening yourself up to stuff almost more, and whether you believe it's an external thing or your subconscious, like, it doesn't really matter. Like, it's that sensation of, like, you're kind of turning your critical brain off and just, like, letting things come out of
Mhm.
you, and usually those things feel very surprising or, you're like, "Where is this coming from? I don't know."
Mhm.
Um, so I think, like, with some of the psychic stuff, it kind of feels like that. It's like being able to get yourself into that state.
Yeah.
Um, it can be hard when you're writing to access that state. Like, for me, it definitely takes, like, a lot of repetitive showing up before I can get to that state. I'm not just like I don't know, there's, like, some writer who talked about how she would just, like, get on the typewriter and just, like, take divine dictation from God,
Mhm.
and that's, like, not usually how I feel, but the moments when I feel that way feel
Mhm.
great.
Mhm.
Um, but so it was, like, sort of similar to that, but then also during the pandemic, my grandfather, who I grew up with and was very close with, died, and so it felt like it went from this sort of abstract idea of, like, contacting the dead to, like, a specific sort of desire to be in touch with a specific person who I just lost, and
Mhm.
then that feeling, like, I could just feel my, like, desperation, and how it was, like, bending things to make me be like, "Yeah, maybe this is real," even when it didn't feel real at all, and so
Mhm.
that kind of felt, like, not good, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something I've seen and heard of because I've done some research into mediums, and at the theater where I worked, we had mediums come and do their thing for an audience. And it was interesting to see when it felt like something was truly just clicking and just happening versus when it felt like someone was desperately trying to make something fit because they really wanted to have a message from this person, and sometimes we're just devastated when it didn't make sense or it didn't seem to be happening, and it was very hard because I think that desperation to speak with somebody again is something we've all felt.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's not that I believe or don't believe I feel like
Mhm.
whenever people talk about it in terms of belief, it's always kind of strange to me because, like, when you've actually experienced something, you don't really need to believe or not believe. It's just something you've felt
Mhm.
and experienced it. So, I think like when people ask like, "Oh, do you believe in ghosts or do you believe in this and that?" And it's like, well, I haven't experienced them. Like I've never
Mhm.
seen a ghost, but I feel like if I had seen one, I wouldn't really need to believe in them. It's like I've seen one. So what's
Yeah.
there to, it's not really like it doesn't really require faith. Like I've definitely experienced things that like I've had dreams where dead people visited me,
Mhm.
and those felt like very different from just dreams about those people. And I definitely felt their presence with me. And it was very kind of, it was just something I've experienced. So, like, whether
Mhm.
I believe, like, it doesn't really require my belief in it, I guess. I just have definitely, like, had those types of experiences um,
Mhm.
where I've felt somebody after their death. But I've only felt that in a dream state. I've never felt that when I was awake.
Yeah. And it is I've known some people who have felt that. I've known some people my grandfather was one who was strictly like, "Ghosts are not real, that's a ridiculous thing to believe," who still had a ghost experience himself, and he tried to write it off. He was like, "Clearly I was hallucinating or something was happening," but it was interesting to see that, like, even if you're somebody who completely writes this off, it may still happen, and you can't explain it then, or you can try to, but clearly the explanations are not satisfying enough or you wouldn't be talking about it so much.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
there's so much we just don't understand, and I think
mhm,
that's upsetting for people. They wanna be able to, like, be more definitive, I think.
mhm. And that's very understandable because it'd be nice if we all got definitive answers. And I think that was another thing I liked about reading Jinya's journey is that sort of she wants almost definitive answers, it seems, from everybody but herself. So she can just follow what somebody else is doing and not have to worry about what she actually wants to be doing or any answers that she might find internally that she
Yeah.
wants to ignore.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think it is a story of her learning to listen to her internal desires, yeah, which is
mhm,
something that I think, um, we are often taught not to do growing up, so it like, relearning how to do that is something that can
mhm.
happen later in life.
Yeah. And we're getting to the end, but I really wanted to also ask because I know you were born in Moscow, similar to Zhinya, who also was born in Russia and came to the United States. Do you clearly your Russian history and the culture you grew up with influenced this book a lot? Do you feel that I'm trying to think of how to phrase this? I had it written in a way that made sense, and now I'm trying to rephrase it. But do you feel it's kind of an inherent part of Russian culture is this sort of difference from American culture? Because I mentioned I grew up with Russian siblings, so I had some experience to it, though I'm not Russian myself. Do you think that difference or that sort of jarring difference between those two cultures really informed yourself and informed this book a lot? Or me?
Yeah, I mean, I think, growing up I came to the US when I was 3 and a half, so, like,
Mhm,
growing up, I spoke Russian with my family, and, like, there's that culture at home, and then there's a totally different culture, like, at school and in the outside world, and I feel like that sort of, I think lots of people experience that, like, you don't necessarily have to be, like, an immigrant to live in to have a family culture that's very different from, like,
mhm,
the outside culture, you know? And I think, like, that's kind of, like, where code switching comes in and stuff like that, like, trying to be one way with you kind of end up splitting, right? And you're one way with your friends, and you're a different way with your family. I mean, I think that's something that, like, most people experience, whether they're from a different culture or not, these,
mhm,
like, different selves. And I think, like, definitely being like, having a family that had different sort of, like, cultural beliefs and understandings made me, I think, aware of, like, the fact that there isn't like a monolith, like there isn't like one
Mm.
experience. There's many experiences. And I think, that's something my book definitely deals with, is like people's perceptions are different, and like trying to understand other people and their experiences is like very important to me as a writer. And it's also something that like, the characters in my book are like trying to understand each other and like bridge
Mhm.
these spaces that sometimes feel, to some extent unbridgeable, because like you don't know other people's experiences, even when you think you're very close to somebody. I think it's very hard to to just like to be able to really like understand. I think a lot of times we have the illusion that we're all in like a shared reality, just like
Mhm.
we have the illusion that we're like a single, constant person. And like that's not true. We're not in a shared reality.
Mhm.
Everybody's experiences are very different,
Mhm.
and informed by their past. And I'm sure, the fact that I was like an immigrant, and that my family came from the Soviet Union, like all of that, I'm sure has like informed a lot of things that I see. Like Soviet culture was very different than American culture in a lot of ways, which is something that like is explored a little bit in the book. But like one of the ways is there's just this like bluntness in communication, that I think like some people who read the book weren't like familiar with. Like I think that's probably like not just Soviet, but like I think a lot of immigrant cultures, there's just like a directness that can seem really harsh or really honest depending on, your perspective.
Mhm.
But I think like for someone from the US, like is just like, why are they so mean?
Yeah.
Why are these characters so mean? Um, but I feel like I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah. And maybe it's my exposure to a similar culture or people from a similar culture where I definitely didn't interpret the characters as mean. I understood sort of where they were coming from with that style of communication. And maybe it's me being somebody who is not the most socially graceful. So when people are very direct with me, I'm like, oh, thank God. You are just saying to me what you think. And I love that. You're not making me play a guessing game, as we so often end up doing in polite American culture, particularly Midwestern culture, which is where I
Yeah.
grew up. So you people sort of make you figure it out what they actually mean. So I loved seeing that style of communication and love experiencing it in real life as well.
It has its pluses and minuses, I would say.
Yeah, there's definitely been times where I know I've done it. I've been guilty of saying something very directly, and people were like, maybe you should have thought of a different way to phrase that. And I don't realize that until after when someone points it out to me, or until after I said it, and then I'm just like, oh, I did say it like that.
We've all been there.
Yes. But I also wanted to ask, this is what I like to always ask as a second to last question, which is there anything I should have asked about or that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
Um, I guess I can just talk about my events that are coming up in case
Yes.
people who are watching this
Mm-hmm.
are watching this live or before the events have taken place. I'm doing a reading in Los Angeles next Wednesday. That's the 13th, with Otessa Moshfegh at Skylight Books at 7 p.m. The 19th, which is a Tuesday, March 19th, in New York at McNally Jackson in Soho with Rachel Lyon, and the 21st in Boston at Newtonville Books with Juliet Grames. So if anyone watching this wants to come out and say hi, I will be at those locations. And you can look on my website or my Instagram for that information.
Yes, and all of that, Katya's Instagram, a link to pre-order Mother Doll, which you definitely should do. It's releasing this next Tuesday. And Katya's social media, her X and IG, are in the comments of this video, so definitely go and check those out. And thank you so much, Katya, for being a guest with us. And thank you to everybody who's joined us.
Thank you so much. And if you guys pre-order from Skylight Books, you can get autographed copies and you can have personalized inscriptions written in them.
Awesome. That is great to know. But and thank you, everybody. We will see you next time.